When I want to understand the risks of Lou Gehrig's disease, I ask the butcher. When I want to understand thermodynamics, I ask a barber. When I want to understand quantum physics, I ask any random yahoo on the street who has an opinion. No, of course I don't. Why? Because there's a world of difference between people with real knowledge and expertise and people who just have their own opinions. Welcome back, and thank you for wanting to know the facts and the truth. What's going on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is big. You can't miss it on the news. You can't miss it on college campuses, and you really can't miss it online. But what are the facts? Why is this happening? That's what we're here to answer. Our approach is to examine the major themes and focus on the important events that help you make sense of what's happening today. We care about knowing the truth. We also care about the basic human right to live in peace. We care about ending the suffering. We care about finding justice. And we think you're here because you do too. The only path for us then is to go after the facts and be open to what they show us. Life can be beautiful without hatred, violence, and war, and maybe the way there starts with better understanding each other. Better understanding the Jewish people, the Palestinian people, the history of their conflicts and past peace efforts, and some of the major issues standing in the way of forging real peace. What the Hell is Going On in Gaza is a 9-part series made up of 30 episodes, each designed to help you understand a different but important part of the picture. As part 5 of our series continues, we'll keep giving you the facts you need to answer the question, who does the world blame? It's important because it has a real effect on what you hear. Here in episode 23, we'll tackle the question, does Israel fight fair? We need to take a hard look at this, not just because some are accusing Israel of war crimes, recklessly or purposely bombing civilians and starving the people of Gaza, but because there's a profound moral issue, and that matters, even in war. So let's get started. If we're going to judge whether what Israel's doing right now is right or wrong, then first we need to have a basis for judging. So how do we judge? All war is terrible and causes suffering, death, and destruction. The videos and images from Gaza are heartbreaking, as were the images from Israel after October 7th, as were the images from Syria, Iraq, and most everywhere else that war has destroyed. But just because it's awful doesn't mean it's wrong. The right questions are, is it necessary? Is it legal? Let's start with, is it necessary? What do we know? We know Hamas is an internationally recognized terrorist entity that has sworn to destroy Israel. Hamas's army of 30,000 fighters has attacked and will continue to attack Israel, and they'll continue to do it while hiding behind civilians and civilian infrastructure, then disappearing down into their tunnel system. This makes ad hoc, limited military responses completely impractical. They can't work. And that leaves Israel only 2 choices: destroy Hamas or allow continued attacks and atrocities against Israeli citizens, which means more October 7ths and worse. In an earlier episode, we discussed that Hamas does not want peace. It only wants the destruction of Israel. In his own words, senior Hamas leader Ghazi Hamad said, quote, "There will be a second, third, and fourth attack." Khaled Mashal, former chairman of Hamas's political bureau, said in a 2018 Al Jazeera TV interview that, quote, "We agree to a state within the pre-1967 borders, but without ceding the rest of Palestine and without recognizing Israel." Think about that statement for a minute. It means Hamas wants all of Palestine, from the river to the sea, and it means the destruction of Israel. To many in the West, describing Hamas's attacks as terrorism implies a Western conception of what that means, which is based on the Western experience of terrorism, a terrible but isolated attack that is not an existential threat. It may warrant punishment, but it's not like, quote, real war. That paradigm is not applicable for Israel. We have to reset and reorient our thinking. The terrorism against Israel is constant, not isolated, and the threat to Israel is very much existential. Israel will cease to exist if it does not destroy the enemy that is trying every day to destroy Israel. Not only that, but what do you think will happen to the 9 million Israeli citizens living there? It's certain to look an awful lot like October 7th. Consider what retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, former U.S. National Security Advisor, said in an interview with Bloomberg. Quote, "I don't think Israel has much choice. The only way to address Hamas is to destroy Hamas. They are a death cult. What the Israeli government has set out as their objective, I think, is the only plausible objective, is the complete destruction of the organization, no longer a threat to Israel." Former U.S. CIA Director David Petraeus told the audience at an Institute for National Security Studies conference that Israel was doing, quote, "an excellent job," and that, quote, "the key now is not to stop until Hamas is fully destroyed." Israeli War Cabinet member Benny Gantz told U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan that, quote, "ending the war without clearing out Rafah, that is, finishing off Hamas, is like sending a firefighter to extinguish 80% of the fire." British historian, author, and political commentator Douglas Murray said something similar on the History for the Curious podcast. Quote, "I feel very personal about it, not just as a British citizen, but as a human being. Hamas is a fire. Hamas needs to be put out, needs to be destroyed. There's no point in destroying 3/4 of Hamas. The fire will start again next month, next year, 3 years down the line." With all we've learned so far about Hamas, its beliefs, and its very sincere intentions, the answer to the question of whether it's necessary for Israel to destroy Hamas is perfectly clear. Yes. The next part of this question is more tactical. Is the way Israel is conducting the war necessary? To answer this, we have to consider the tactical landscape, the reality in which Israel has to fight. Hamas has invested perhaps billions of dollars in its military and terrorist infrastructure to allow it to hide in tunnels deep under Gaza's cities and within its civilian infrastructure. Hamas fights from these cities and from hospitals and schools. This is not like any other war. There is no other way to defeat Hamas. The Western paradigm of tanks firing at each other as they roll across a vast open desert or the fields of Europe simply does not apply here. While there are countless pundits and politicians eager to judge Israel's tactics and conduct, most do not have the knowledge and experience to do that. Some of these critics have demonized Israel, claiming the destruction and civilian casualties in Gaza are among the worst in the history of warfare. Many of those highly publicized claims are false. Despite the assertions of these unqualified critics, there are numerous experienced military experts who do see Israel's tactics and conduct as both necessary and appropriate. John Spencer is the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. He is eminently qualified to judge Israel's tactics. In February 2024, he told Newsweek magazine, quote, "Given the scale and context of an enemy purposely entrenched in densely populated urban areas, as well as the presence of tunnels, hostages, rockets, attackers that follow the laws of war while defenders purposely do not, and proximity to the front lines and the home front, there is basically no historical comparison for this war. Gaza is not like other wars." With respect to finding its closest comparison, though, Spencer said, quote, "A battle that does bear a resemblance to Israel's war against Hamas is the 1945 Battle of Manila, the largest urban struggle of World War II, with more civilian casualties incurred than even the Battle of Stalingrad. The city had a population of 1.1 million residents, as well as over 1,000 American prisoners of war being held in the city. It took the U.S. military 35,000 forces and a whole month to defeat 17,000 Japanese Navy defenders in and around the city. Like in Gaza, the defenders used the city's sewer and tunnel systems for offensive and defensive purposes, and there were over 100,000 civilian deaths from the battle. Israel's fight against Hamas is necessary because Hamas has made it necessary. Israel's approach to the war is appropriate because there is no other way to defeat Hamas. Our next question is it legal? Meaning, is Israel breaking laws and committing war crimes? As with questions on the extent of damage to civilian infrastructure in Gaza, the pundit class is quick to assert that Israel is violating the laws of war and committing war crimes. That simply is not true. When people refer to legality or crimes in the context of war, they are typically referring to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which defined rules of conduct for warfare. They were later expanded in 1977, though neither Israel nor the United States are parties to the 1977 protocols, though some critics refer to the 1977 protocols as if they were the agreed-to world standard. Regardless, though, there are principles relating to civilians that most of us would agree are moral and appropriate. Number one, no targeting of civilians. As we addressed earlier in the series, Israel does not target civilians. Number two, precautions should be taken to minimize civilian casualties. As we addressed earlier in this series, Israel takes extraordinary precautions to minimize civilian casualties, more so than any other nation in history. Number three, potential civilian casualties should be proportionate to the importance of the target. The concept of proportionality gets a lot of attention from critics of Israel, but they seem to misunderstand what it means. It does not mean that Israel cannot cause more casualties than Hamas did. So, are Israel's actions proportionate? Well, what's more strategically important than an existential fight to save your nation and your people from extermination at the hands of terrorists who are so open about their intentions? And if we want to be more tactically focused than that, the strategic necessity of destroying Hamas's terrorist infrastructure and eliminating the ability of its forces and leadership to continue their campaign of violence should be obvious. Of course, this concept is often applied as well to individual military actions. We can't possibly review them all here, so let's look at it from a different angle. We know that Israel has maintained a historically low ratio of civilian to military casualties. That just couldn't be the case if Israel were recklessly or purposely targeting civilians in Gaza's densely populated territory. Israel has done so by warning civilians of danger, canceling operations when civilians are in the area, establishing humanitarian corridors and pauses in the fighting. It would make no sense for Israel to do these things, then act with careless disregard or evil intent toward civilians in its military operations. That's just not logical. Because Israel's purpose and actions are strategically important, and because Israel takes extraordinary precautions to minimize civilian casualties, yes, Israel's actions meet the standard of being proportionate. Let's talk more about the laws of war. CBS News published an article titled, "What are the Laws of War and How Do They Apply to the Israel-Gaza Conflict?" The article stated that protecting civilians depended on three factors. The first was that civilians must abstain from fighting. There is considerable evidence that many Gazans have not, and this is obviously at their own risk. Maybe more relevantly, in Gaza, it is difficult to distinguish between Hamas and civilians as Hamas dresses in civilian clothes and hides among civilians. Appropriately, Israel considers everyone with a gun to be a combatant. The second was that the party in control of the civilian population not put them in harm's way by using them as human shields. As we discussed earlier, Hamas has violated this principle for decades and continues to do so. The third was that the attacking force take precautions to avoid or minimize civilian casualties. Again, as we covered in detail earlier this series, Israel takes greater precautions to avoid and minimize civilian casualties than any military force in history. Hamas intentionally does exactly the opposite, causing civilian casualties is fundamental to their strategy. We discussed John Spencer earlier. He is the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point and is much of an expert on these matters as there is. He posted that, quote, 100% Israel has followed the laws of war, have implemented measures to protect civilians and prevent harm, more than any military in history under even close to similar context. There is no comparison. There has been no evidence Israel targeted aid workers, journalists, or civilians. In an article published by the New York Post, Spencer wrote, quote, in my long career studying and advising on urban warfare for the U.S. military, I've never known an army to take such measures to attend to the enemy's civilian population. In fact, by my analysis, Israel has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history, above and beyond what international law requires, and more than the United States did in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Spencer went on to say that the ratio of combatants to civilian casualties, even using the obviously overstated Hamas-supplied casualty figures, Israel has managed to maintain a ratio that is, quote, historically low for modern urban warfare. In addition, he said, quote, yet analysts who should know better condemn the IDF based on the level of destruction that still occurred, destruction that's unavoidable against an enemy that embeds in a vast tunnel system under civilian sites in dense urban terrain. There is simply no basis for claiming Israel's actions in Gaza are not legal, and there is plenty of evidence that Israel takes extraordinary steps to ensure that is the case. No doubt that's in part because Israel knows all too well that the world can't wait to accuse it of every heinous wrongdoing imaginable. Another question being asked is, what about Israel's responsibility to provide humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza? Is Israel doing enough to ensure the flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza? That is not necessarily an inappropriate question. We should all care about minimizing human suffering. However, the accusation that Israel intentionally tries to starve Palestinians or otherwise interferes with the flow of aid for the purpose of hurting Palestinians is baseless and wrong. Israelis are just people, the same as you or me. The challenge in trying to make sense of what's going on is that when it comes to the delivery of humanitarian aid in an urban war zone, it can be difficult to assess what's going on. It's a complicated, multi-party process in an environment where not all parties can be trusted. Before getting into the specifics, there are a few things that need to be mentioned. First, Israel has legitimate security concerns. Decades of weapons smuggling into Gaza warrant Israel's diligence in checking the contents of trucks entering Gaza. Whatever other problems exist, this takes time too. Second, Israel again is being subjected to a double standard. Literally, there has been no other war where the world demanded the country fighting back had an obligation for humanitarian aid to the other side's civilians. But that's what's expected of Israel. And third, where is the comparable world outcry and condemnation about insufficient levels of humanitarian aid getting to civilians in other conflict zones, like Yemen or Sudan? There is no outcry. Now, let's dig deeper. According to ABC News, in an April 2024 article titled Gaza Aid Timeline, How the Hunger Crisis Unfolded Amid the Israel-Hamas War, quote, some aid organizations have accused Israel of not providing enough authorization to deliver sufficient aid, and even when it does give authorization, heavy fighting makes it difficult to deliver that aid. Israel denies these accusations and said the UN, its partners, and other aid agencies have created logistical challenges, resulting in a bottleneck. Additionally, the Israeli government said Hamas often steals aid meant for civilians. There are plenty of accusations to go around, which maybe isn't surprising since no one party can control the entire process. Aid trucks had to pass through borders guarded by Israel or Egypt or both. And then, once in Gaza, the United Nations played a role. Independent contractors hired by the UN or Hamas or international NGOs played a role, and of course, so did Hamas. A Times of Israel article in March titled, "Headed to North Gaza, Aid Trucks Face a Gauntlet of Armed Looters and Starving Civilians," reported on the theft of aid once it entered Gaza. Quote, "These gangs, as well as groups of Hamas members, often hoard humanitarian aid from convoys and resell it on the black market at highly inflated prices, ignoring the, quote, not for sale markings on each box of food or water." In summary, it is extraordinarily difficult to facilitate the delivery of food aid in an urban war zone. Nonetheless, critics have passionately accused Israel of starving Gazans, even of doing so purposely, but it's just not true. In early June, the Famine Review Committee of the IPC, an organization funded by the United States, the European Union, and the UK, issued a report showing significant flaws in the UN's methodology for determining that a famine in Gaza was imminent. The report identified that the UN only counted some of the food being delivered to Gaza. Private sector food trucks and World Food Program deliveries to bakeries in northern Gaza were excluded. Since the WFP is an arm of the United Nations, the UN wasn't even counting all the food it delivered itself. According to the article, this error changes the assessment from between 75 and 109% of caloric needs being met to between 38 and 49% of caloric needs being met, which is the difference between nutritional adequacy and starvation. The point is that we can hardly look at these facts and conclude, as some of its critics have, that Israel is purposely starving Palestinians in Gaza. We covered a lot of ground in this episode, but it all boils down to an answer to our key question: does Israel fight fair? There is more than enough evidence to conclude that Israel's conduct of the war, its actions in Gaza, have been both necessary and legal. Thank you for watching episode 23 of our series, What the Hell is Going On in Gaza? We hope you got a better understanding of how Israel conducts its war efforts in a manner that is both necessary and legal. Does Israel fight fair? Yes, it does. Let's review what we learned in part 5 of our series, because we covered some important ground. We learned that the world sees things differently when Jews are involved. Pervasive anti-Semitism means that Jews are subjective to a shameful double standard. We learned that death and destruction far worse than we're seeing in the war in Gaza have happened and are happening to Muslim communities in numerous places across the world, but the world doesn't seem to care, and that's because Jews aren't involved. We learned that there are, sadly, many examples of the double standard that Jews in Israel must face. We learned that Israel's conduct in the war in Gaza is consistent with international law and, in fact, far more caring of civilians than any other army. If you'd like to leave a comment or get in touch, visit our website at www.getthefactsmiddleeast.com. We hope you'll keep going and watch episode 24 in part 6. In this special episode, we address some fundamental questions of morality. It's an important perspective you shouldn't miss. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your interest in learning more about the war in Gaza. And remember, where there is no knowledge, there can be no insight.